Elena wiped the sweat from her brow as she polished the last of the brass railings in the grand Westfield concert hall. The morning sun poured through the tall windows, catching dust particles that danced in the air. She'd been at it since 5 in the morning, making sure everything gleamed for tonight's charity gala. At 42, Elena Davison had spent nearly 7 years as part of the cleaning staff at this prestigious venue. She moved like a shadow through the hall, invisible to the wealthy patrons who filled these seats night after night. That was how she preferred it, really. No questions, no attention, just her and her work. She stood up straight, stretching her back after bending over for so long. Her eyes wandered to the massive Steinway grand piano sitting center stage. Black and glossy, it waited patiently for tonight's performer, Victor Khoury, whose posters plastered the walls outside. The greatest pianist of his generation, they called him. Elena allowed herself a small smile. If they only knew. "You missed a spot," came a teasing voice from behind her. Elena turned to see Rose, the head of housekeeping, pointing to a perfectly clean section of railing. "Very funny," Elena replied, tucking a strand of graying hair behind her ear. "I think we're good here. Moving on to the backstage area." Rose checked her watch. "Actually, why don't you take your break now? You've been at it for hours. I'll handle backstage with Tommy." Elena nodded gratefully. Her knees weren't what they used to be, and a rest sounded heavenly. After Rose left, Elena found herself drawn to the stage. The hall was empty, completely empty. She glanced around nervously, then walked up the side steps to the stage, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. She approached the piano with reverence, not daring to touch it. The last time she had touched a piano like this was, well, it had been a very long time. "Hey, you can't be up there!" Elena jumped back as if burned. A young stagehand was looking at her with annoyed eyes. Sorry, she mumbled, hurrying off stage, her cheeks burning with shame. The rest of the day flew by in a flurry of activity. Staff rolled out the red carpet, florists arrived with elaborate arrangements, and caterers set up in the reception hall. Elena kept her head down, focusing on last-minute cleaning jobs and staying out of everyone's way. By early evening, she had changed into the black pants and white button-up shirt that the cleaning staff wore during events. Her job now was to remain unnoticed, dealing with any spills or messes, emptying trash bins and making sure the restrooms stayed pristine throughout the night. The guests began arriving at 7. Women in flowing designer gowns, men in crisp tuxedos. Elena watched them from the shadows of the service corridor. These people lived in a different world than hers, one of privilege and ease. She didn't resent them for it, not anymore. That kind of thinking didn't get you anywhere. From her position near the back of the hall, Elena could see and hear everything once the program began. The charity was raising money for music education in underprivileged schools. The irony wasn't lost on her. Then Victor Khoury took the stage, and despite herself, Elena was captivated. He was younger than she expected, maybe mid-30s, with dark curly hair and an easy, confident smile. The audience applauded enthusiastically as he bowed. Thank you," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Elena recognized immediately as Lebanese. "I'm honored to be here tonight supporting such a worthy cause." He sat at the bench, adjusted it slightly, and then his hands descended onto the keys. He began with a piece Elena knew well, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the familiar notes wash over her. His technique was impeccable, his timing perfect, but something was missing, something she couldn't quite name. After his performance, there was a brief intermission. Elena busied herself cleaning up a spilled drink in the lobby, avoiding eye contact with the chattering guests. When the second half began, things took an unexpected turn. Victor returned to the stage, but instead of sitting at the piano, he took a microphone. "For the next part of our evening, I'd like to try something different," he announced with a mischievous grin. "Music should be for everyone, not just those of us fortunate enough to study at conservatories." The crowd murmured with interest. "So," he continued, "I'd like to invite someone, anyone, from the audience to come up and play something on this beautiful instrument." He patted the Steinway. "Don't worry, you don't need to be good. In fact, the worse you are, the more money I'll personally donate to tonight's cause. $20 per wrong note." The audience laughed, but no one volunteered. Victor's eyes scanned the crowd. "Come now, don't be shy. Surely someone here took a few piano lessons as a child." A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but still no one raised a hand. "All right then," Victor said, his smile widening. "If no one volunteers, I'll have to choose someone myself." His gaze continued to rove over the audience, then, past them, to the back of the hall, to where Elena stood frozen like a deer in headlights. Their eyes met. Elena immediately looked down, but it was too late. "You there," Victor called out, pointing directly at her. "The lady in the staff uniform at the back. Yes, you." A spotlight suddenly blinded Elena. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. "Come up here, please," Victor encouraged, waving her forward as the audience turned. In their seats to look at her, Elena shook her head frantically, mouthing no and taking a step backward. "Oh, come on," Victor persisted, his tone light but insistent. "It's all for charity. I promise we won't laugh." Too much. Some of the audience members chuckled. One of Victor's friends, a man in an expensive suit who'd been drinking champagne all evening, stood up. "I'll add $5,000 to the pot if the cleaning lady plays," he announced loudly, drawing more laughter and a round of applause. Elena felt trapped. Rose appeared beside her, whispering urgently, "Just go up there and play a simple tune. It's for charity, and Mr. Crawford is watching." Mr. Crawford was the owner of the concert hall, and technically her boss. With leaden feet, Elena made her way down the aisle toward the stage. The spotlight followed her, exposing her worn shoes, her calloused hands, her graying hair pulled back in a simple bun. She felt every eye in the room on her, heard whispers and snickers as she passed. As she climbed the steps to the stage, Victor approached her, microphone still in hand. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elena," she replied, her voice barely audible. He brought the microphone closer. "Sorry, I didn't catch that." "Elena," she repeated, a bit louder this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's give Elena a warm welcome," Victor announced to the audience, who applauded politely but with obvious amusement in their eyes. He leaned closer to her, speaking quietly so only she could hear. "Just play anything. Chopsticks, heart and soul, whatever you know. It's all in good fun." Elena stood rooted to the spot, trembling slightly, staring at the gleaming piano as if it might bite her. "Go on," Victor encouraged, gently leading her to the bench. She sat down stiffly, her back ramrod straight, hands resting in her lap. The audience waited expectantly. Someone coughed. Someone else whispered loudly, "This should be good." Victor's friend called out, "Remember, $5,000, make it worth my while." More laughter rippled through the audience. Elena closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm her racing heart. It had been 23 years since she'd touched a piano. 23 years since she'd allowed herself this one thing that had once been her entire world. She opened her eyes and slowly, hesitantly, lifted her hands to the keys. They hovered there for a long moment as the audience watched with bemused anticipation. A memory flashed through her mind. Her old teacher in Moscow telling her, "The piano knows when you're afraid. Don't be afraid, little one." Elena took a deep breath, then another, and she placed her fingers on the keys. The first notes were tentative, unsure, a simple C major scale moving up the keyboard, then back down. She could sense Victor's relief beside her that she could at least play something basic. But then, as her fingers remembered their old strength, as the muscle memory kicked in after all these years, something shifted. Elena straightened her shoulders slightly. Her hands began to move with more confidence, finding their way to positions they had once known so well. She began to play the opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. Behind her, she heard Victor's small intake of breath. Elena's world narrowed to just her hands and the keys beneath them. The piece started gently, almost questioning, but she knew what was coming. The technical challenges, the emotional depths, the story the music would tell. A story not unlike her own. As the first complex passage approached, Elena felt a sudden surge of panic. Could she still do this? But her fingers seemed to have a mind of their own, flying across the keys with an accuracy that surprised even her. The laughter in the room had completely stopped. In its place was a silence so profound it seemed to have physical weight. And Elena played on, her body remembering what her mind had tried so hard to forget. The music poured out of Elena like a river breaking through a dam. Her fingers remembered every note, every subtle change in tempo, every crescendo and diminuendo of Chopin's masterpiece. A piece considered one of the most difficult in the piano repertoire, a challenge even for acclaimed concert pianists. Victor Khoury stood to the side, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide with disbelief. The wealthy man who had offered $5,000 lowered his champagne glass slowly, as if in a trance. The entire hall had fallen under a spell, the audience leaning forward in their seats, straining to understand what they were witnessing. As Elena reached the technically demanding middle section, her hands became a blur across the keyboard. The years melted away. She was no longer a 42-year-old cleaning lady with aching knees and calloused hands. She was music itself. Her body swayed slightly as she played, giving physical form to the emotion in the music. When she reached the powerful, thunderous passages, her face reflected the storm in the notes. In the tender moments, a softness came over her features that transformed her completely. The audience sat in stunned silence. No coughing, no whispers, not even the rustle of programs. Just the sound of Elena's soul pouring through her fingers onto the keys of the Steinway. 23 years since she had touched a piano. 23 years of silence. And yet, her hands knew exactly what to do. As if they had been secretly practicing all this time while she scrubbed floors and polished railings. Victor had backed away several steps, his face a mixture of shock, confusion, and growing wonder. He was a world-class pianist himself, and he knew better than anyone in the room just how extraordinary Elena's playing truly was. This wasn't merely good for an amateur. This wasn't merely surprising from a cleaning lady. This was mastery, the kind that took decades of intensive study and innate rare talent. As Elena approached the final section of the piece, tears began to stream down her face. She didn't notice them. She was lost in the music, reunited with the part of herself she had buried so deeply for so long. When the final notes resonated through the hall, Elena's hands remained suspended above the keys for a long moment, as if reluctant to break the spell. Then they fell slowly to her lap. Silence. 1 heartbeat. 2. Then the entire hall erupted. People jumped to their feet, applauding wildly, some shouting, "Bravo!" Others were crying openly. A woman in the front row had her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Elena sat motionless on the bench, looking slightly dazed, as if waking from a dream. The applause washed over her like a physical wave, but she seemed unable to fully comprehend what was happening. Victor finally moved forward, reaching for the microphone he had set down. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, but his voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Ladies and gentlemen, He shook his head, at a loss for words for perhaps the first time in his career. Instead, he simply turned to Elena and extended his hand to her. She looked at it as if uncertain what he wanted her to do. Then, hesitantly, she placed her hand in his and he gently pulled her to her feet. The applause grew even louder. People were stamping their feet now, creating a thunderous roar that filled the hall. Elena stood awkwardly beside Victor, her eyes downcast, her shoulders hunched slightly as if trying to make herself smaller, to disappear back into invisibility, but it was too late for that. Far too late. "Who are you?" Victor finally managed to ask, his voice barely audible above the continuing applause. He had switched off the microphone, so only Elena could hear him. She glanced up at him briefly, then away again. "Just Elena," she said softly. "I clean the hall." Victor shook his head in disbelief. "No," he said. "No, that's not who you are." He turned the microphone back on. "Ladies and gentlemen," he addressed the audience, who gradually quieted to hear him. I don't quite know what to say. I think we've all just witnessed something extraordinary. He looked at Elena with new eyes, filled with respect and more than a little awe. Would you mind telling us where you learned to play like that, Elena? He held the microphone out to her. Elena recoiled slightly, looking like she wanted nothing more than to run from the stage. Please, Victor said quietly. They want to know, I want to know. Elena's hands twisted nervously in front of her. She leaned toward the microphone but didn't take it from him. Moscow, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The conservatory. A murmur of surprise ran through the audience. The Moscow Conservatory, Victor repeated, his eyebrows shooting up. You studied at the Moscow Conservatory? Elena gave a tiny nod. When? Victor pressed gently. A long time ago, she replied, her voice strengthening slightly. I was very young. From the front row, an elderly man with thick glasses stood up slowly. Excuse me, he called out, his voice carrying clearly despite his age. May I ask your full name, my dear? Elena looked at him, hesitating. Then, almost reluctantly, she said, Elena Davison now, but then I was Elena Petrova. The old man's face went pale. He sat down hard in his seat, a hand going to his heart. Are you all right, sir? Victor asked, concerned. Yes, the man replied, waving away the concern. It's just, if this is the same Elena Petrova. He trailed off, shaking his head in wonder. A woman sitting next to him leaned over to whisper something. He nodded vigorously. Sir, do you know Miss Davison? Victor asked. The elderly man stood again. Not personally, no. But if she is who I think she is. Elena Petrova was a legend in music circles 30 years ago. A child prodigy who won the Tchaikovsky Youth Competition at age 12. She was set to become one of the greatest pianists of her generation. He looked at Elena with newfound recognition. Then she disappeared, completely. No one knew what happened to her. All eyes turned to Elena, who seemed to shrink under the attention. Is that true? Victor asked her quietly. Elena gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The audience buzzed, with excitement and confusion. Phones had come out. People were typing rapidly, searching for information. Oh my God, a woman near the front called out, staring at her phone screen. It is her. I found an old article with a photo. Elena Petrova, child prodigy, disappeared from the music world in the early 2000s. Elena took a step back, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the growing commotion. Victor sensed her distress and stepped slightly in front of her, shielding her somewhat from the audience's intense focus. Ladies and gentlemen, he said into the microphone, I think we've imposed on Ms. Davison enough for one evening. This was meant to be a charity event, and thanks to her extraordinary performance, I believe donations will be at an all-time high. He turned to the man who had offered $5,000. Sir, I believe you owe this charity a considerable sum. The wealthy man stood, seemingly still in a daze. 10,000, he said. I'm doubling it to $10,000. This announcement drew another round of applause. And I'll match it, called out another voice from the crowd. As will I, added a woman in an emerald gown. Victor grinned. Well, it seems our music education fund just got a significant boost. He turned back to Elena. Thank you, he said sincerely. You've done more for music education tonight than I ever could have. Elena nodded, her eyes still lowered, clearly eager to leave the stage. Victor hesitated, then asked quietly, Would you play one more piece, please? For the first time that evening, Elena looked directly into his eyes. Hers were a deep brown, filled with a complex mixture of pain, fear, and something else. A flicker of something that might have been joy. I don't think I can, she whispered. It's been so long. You just played Chopin's first ballad perfectly after 23 years. Victor reminded her gently, I think you can play anything. Elena bit her lip, considering. The audience waited with bated breath. Then, slowly, she nodded. Victor beamed and announced to the crowd, Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Davison has graciously agreed to play one more piece for us tonight." Wild applause greeted this news. Elena returned to the piano bench, sitting down with a little more confidence this time. She closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. Then she began to play Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor. Once again, the hall filled with extraordinary music. Once again, the audience was transported by the skill and emotion pouring from Elena's hands. But this time, as she played, Elena's face changed. The tension in her shoulders eased, and ever so slowly, a small smile formed on her lips. For the first time in 23 years, Elena Petrova was home. The charity gala ended in a blur of excitement. People swarmed toward the stage after Elena's second performance, everyone talking at once, reaching out to her, asking questions. Elena, overwhelmed by the attention, had backed away, nearly stumbling, in her haste to escape. Victor had stepped in, thanking the audience for their generosity and announcing that the official program had concluded. He'd guided Elena gently but firmly through a side door and into the relative quiet of the backstage area. "Are you all right?" he'd asked, genuine concern in his eyes. Elena had nodded, though her hands were shaking. "I need to get back to work," she'd said quietly. Victor had stared at her in disbelief. "Back to cleaning? After what just happened?" But Rose had appeared then, putting a protective arm around Elena's shoulders. "She's had enough for one night," Rose had told Victor firmly. "Let her be." That had been 3 hours ago. Now Elena sat alone in her tiny apartment, still wearing her work uniform, staring at her phone. It wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications. Somehow someone had found her on social media, an account she rarely used, and the messages were pouring in. A video was going viral, a video of her playing. Elena pressed her hands to her face, trying to steady her breathing. What had she done? 23 years of hiding, of burying her past undone in a single impulsive moment. Her small studio apartment felt even smaller tonight. The walls seemed to be closing in. On her nightstand sat the only photo she had kept from her previous life, a faded picture of a serious-looking girl of 12, standing beside a stern, older woman in front of the Moscow Conservatory. Elena hadn't wanted to keep anything, not after everything that happened, but somehow she could never bring herself to throw away this one photo. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. Unknown number. Elena almost didn't answer, but something told her she should. "Hello," she said hesitantly. "Elena Petrova?" The voice was elderly, with a slight Russian accent. "This is Pavel Dmitriev. I was at the concert tonight." Elena's breath caught. Pavel Dmitriev was a legendary music critic who had once written about her when she was a child. "Yes," she replied, softly. "I remember you, my dear girl," the old man said, his voice warm with emotion. "Where have you been? The world thought you were gone." Elena closed her eyes. "I was gone," she said, "in all the ways that mattered." There was a pause. Then, "Will you tell me what happened? The world deserves to know your story." Elena looked around her small apartment, at the second-hand furniture, the worn carpet, the walls that needed painting, at the life she had built from the ashes of her old one. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "Please," Pavel urged. "I'm meeting some colleagues for coffee tomorrow morning at the Little Cup Cafe near the concert hall. Just come and talk. No pressure, no recordings, nothing formal. Just talk." Elena hesitated, then surprising herself. "What time?" The Little Cup Cafe was busier than usual for a Wednesday morning. Word had gotten out that the cleaning lady Pianist might make an appearance, and curious onlookers had flocked to the small coffee shop. Elena almost turned back when she saw the crowd. But Pavel spotted her from his table by the window and waved her over, his face lighting up. He wasn't alone. Beside him sat Victor Kuri and an elegant woman in her 60s who Elena didn't recognize. "You came," Pavel said, standing to greet her. "I'm so glad. Please sit." Elena sat down awkwardly, acutely aware of her simple jeans and sweater amid the more polished appearance of the others. You know Victor already, Pavel said. And this is Josephine Bailey, director of the Westfield Symphony Orchestra. I've been dying to meet you, Josephine said, extending her hand. What you did last night was, well, there are no words. Elena shook her hand briefly, then looked down at the table. We ordered you a latte, Pavel said, pushing a steaming mug toward her. Unless you prefer something else? No, that's fine. Thank you. An awkward silence fell. Elena could feel them watching her, waiting. So, Pavel finally began, would you be willing to tell us what happened? After the Tchaikovsky competition, you were set to study with Alexei Orlov at the Moscow Conservatory. Then, nothing. You vanished. Elena wrapped her hands around the warm mug, drawing strength from its heat. She had never told anyone the whole story. Not even Rose knew more than bits and pieces. My father died, she said softly, 3 weeks after the competition. The others at the table remained silent, giving her space to continue. He had been sick for a while, but he hid it from everyone. He didn't want to distract me from my music. Elena's voice threatened to break, but she steadied it. He was my biggest supporter. My mother had left when I was 4. She couldn't
handle the pressure of raising a prodigy, she said. So it was just me and my father. Elena took a sip of her latte, gathering her thoughts.
After he died, I discovered we were deeply in debt. All the money had gone to my training, my travel to competitions, the best teachers. We had nothing left. Worse than nothing. We had creditors calling day and night. Pavel nodded sadly. The cost of nurturing exceptional talent is rarely discussed, but it can be enormous. I was 12, Elena continued. I went to live with my aunt in a small apartment on the outskirts of Moscow. She was kind, but poor. There was no piano, no money. For lessons, my scholarship at the conservatory included tuition but not living expenses. But surely there were patrons who would have helped, Josephine asked. Someone with your talent. Elena shook her head. My father had always handled that side of things. I was just a child. I didn't know how to ask for help, how to find sponsors. And my aunt? She paused. My aunt thought music was a frivolous dream. She wanted me to focus on practical studies that would lead to a stable job. So you gave it up? Victor asked, disbelief in his voice. Not right away, Elena replied. For 2 years, I snuck into practice rooms at a local music school when they were empty. I played whenever I could. But then my aunt got sick and I needed to work to help support us both. She took another sip of her latte. By the time I was 16, I hadn't touched a piano in over a year. At 18, I met an American businessman who was in Moscow for work. We got married, and I moved to the States. That's where the name Davison comes from. Pavel nodded. Yes. Thomas Davison. He was a good man, but the marriage didn't last. We wanted different things. Elena's eyes grew distant. When we divorced, I was 35 with no career, no college degree, and barely enough English to get by. I took whatever jobs I could find. Eventually, I ended up at the concert hall. Cleaning the very instrument you once mastered, Victor said quietly. That must have been torture. Elena's eyes met his. Actually, it was the closest thing to peace I'd felt in years. Being near the music, even if I couldn't play it. It was something. But why didn't you ever play again? Josephine asked. Even privately? Elena looked down at her hands that had once been her pride, now roughened by years of manual labor. Shame, she said simply. Failure. I had been told my whole life that I was destined for greatness. And instead, she gestured vaguely at herself. Instead, you became a hardworking woman who survived tremendous loss, Pavel said firmly. There is no shame in that, my dear. Elena's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. Maybe not, but the longer I went without playing, the harder it became to start again. It was like a door I had locked and thrown away, the key. Until last night, Victor said. What changed last night? Elena thought about it. I don't know exactly. Maybe it was being put on the spot. Maybe it was hearing you play earlier and thinking about how I would have interpreted the piece differently. A small smile touched her lips. Or maybe it was just time. The cafe had grown quieter. People at nearby tables were straining to hear their conversation. What happens now? Pavel asked gently. Elena shrugged. I go back to work. Tomorrow is my day off, but Friday I'm scheduled for the morning cleaning shift. Victor nearly choked on his coffee. You can't be serious. What else would I do? Elena asked, genuine confusion in her voice. The three others exchanged glances. Play, Josephine said firmly. Elena, you must play again. Elena shook her head. I'm 42 years old. Professional pianists begin their careers in their teens or 20s. It's too late for me. Nonsense, Pavel declared. With your talent, with your soul, age is irrelevant. The video of you playing has over 2 million views already, Victor added. People are calling you the Cinderella pianist. The world wants to hear more. Elena looked startled. 2 million? Victor pulled out his phone and showed her. There, she was, in her cleaning uniform, playing Chopin with her eyes closed, tears streaming down her face. The comments section was filled with amazement, with people sharing how moved they were, how her playing had brought them to tears. This is overwhelming, Elena whispered. It's just the beginning, Josephine said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. This is a formal invitation for you to perform as a special guest with the Westfield Symphony next month. We're prepared to offer you a fee of $25,000. Elena's eyes widened. That's more than I make in a year. And it's less than you're worth, Pavel said. Much less. Victor leaned forward. I've spoken with my management. They're interested in representing you. Exclusive recording contracts, international tours, the works. Elena felt dizzy. This is happening too fast. I haven't practiced properly in decades. My technique was flawless last night, Pavel interrupted. Imagine what a few weeks of dedicated practice could do. Elena looked at each of them in turn, these strangers who believed in her more than she believed in herself. I don't even own a piano, she said weakly. Victor grinned. That, at least, is a problem easily solved. Elena stood in the center of her apartment staring in disbelief at the upright piano that now occupied most of her living room. It wasn't a concert grand like the one at Westfield Hall, but it was a quality instrument, a Yamaha with a warm, rich tone. I can't accept this, she said, turning to Victor, who stood by the door looking pleased with himself. It's not a gift, he replied. It's on loan. Consider it a professional courtesy between musicians. Elena ran her fingers lightly over the polished wood. But your management company arranged it? Victor nodded. They're investing in you, Elena. We all are. It had been 5 days since the charity gala. 5 days that had turned Elena's quiet, predictable life completely upside down. The video of her playing had not just gone viral, it had exploded. 30 million views and climbing. News outlets had picked up the story, dubbing it the Cinderella of classical music. People were fascinated by the mystery of the cleaning, lady with the hands of a virtuoso. Elena had gone back to work for one day, only to be called into Mr. Crawford's office. To her surprise, he hadn't been angry about her impromptu performance at the gala. Instead, he'd offered her a leave of absence. Take 6 months, he'd said, with pay. See where this opportunity leads you. Your job will be waiting if you want to come back. The kindness had brought tears to her eyes. Now, standing before this beautiful piano, Elena felt a mixture of excitement and terror. What if she couldn't do it again? What if that night had been a fluke, a moment of muscle memory that couldn't be sustained? I should go, Victor said, sensing her need to be alone. You have my number if you need anything. After he left, Elena sat on the bench, just sitting for a long time without touching the keys. The weight of 23 years pressed down on her. All the might-have-beens, all the lost dreams. Finally, slowly, she placed her hands on the keys and began to play. Just scales at first, simple exercises she remembered from childhood. Her fingers were stiff from years of cleaning work, lacking some of their former flexibility. but the basic technique was still there, buried under layers of time. She played, for hours, until her back ached and her fingers cramped. It felt like waking up after a long sleep. Painful, but necessary. The next day brought another surprise. A package arrived containing several books of sheet music, pieces she had once played as a girl, along with a note from Pavel. To help you remember. And there was more. A reporter from the New York Times wanted to interview her. A documentary filmmaker was interested in telling her story. The classical music world was buzzing with talk of Elena Petrova's miraculous return. Through it all, Elena practiced 6, 8, sometimes 10 hours a day. Her hands developed blisters that turned to calluses of a different kind. Her neighbors complained about the noise until Victor's management company arranged for soundproofing to be installed in her apartment. 3 weeks after the gala, Pavel invited Elena to have lunch with him at a small restaurant near the concert hall. "How is the practice going?" he asked after they had ordered. "Better," Elena said. "Some days are good, some are frustrating." She flexed her fingers unconsciously. "I'm still not where I was." "Where you were at 12? Pavel chuckled. Few adults could match that pure technical brilliance, but you have something now that you didn't have then. "What's that?" Elena asked. "Life," Pavel said simply. "Pain, joy, loss, love, all the things that shape a true artist." Elena looked down at her hands. "I'm scared, Pavel," she admitted. "The symphony performance is in 2 weeks. What if I can't do it? What if I freeze?" Pavel reached across the table and patted her hand. "Then you'll start again. Music isn't a competition anymore, Elena. It's your soul speaking." As they ate, Pavel told her stories about other musicians who had overcome tremendous odds. A violinist who lost 3 fingers and relearned to play with a modified technique. A conductor who went deaf but continued to lead orchestras by feeling the vibrations through the floor. "Your story is remarkable," Pavel said, "but not unique. The path of an artist is rarely smooth." Elena nodded, drawing strength from his words. After lunch, Pavel suggested they take a walk. They ended up at the concert hall where it had all begun. The place was quiet, with no performances scheduled until evening. "Would you like to play the Steinway again?" Pavel asked. "I have some influence with the management." Elena hesitated, then nodded. Pavel spoke briefly with a security guard who recognized Elena from the video and seemed starstruck as he led them to the main hall. The massive space was empty, chairs stacked at the sides, the stage bare except for the grand piano. Elena approached it with reverence. This was the instrument that had awakened her after 23 years of silence. Her fingers trembled slightly as she sat down. "What will you play?" Pavel asked. Elena thought for a moment. "Rachmaninoff, Piano Concerto No. 2. Pavel raised his eyebrows. "Ambitious, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the repertoire." "It was the last piece I was working on before." Elena trailed off. "Before everything changed." She began to play, and the magnificent sound filled the empty hall. The piece started with a series of ominous chords that built in intensity, like someone gathering courage. Then came the melody, achingly beautiful, full of longing and hope. Elena played with her whole body, her whole heart. When she reached a particularly difficult passage, her fingers stumbled briefly. She stopped, frustrated. "Keep going," Pavel encouraged. "Work through it." Elena took a deep breath and started the section again, more slowly this time, focusing on precision. Gradually, her fingers found their way. Neither of them noticed that someone else had entered the hall and stood listening in the shadows. As Elena reached the triumphant finale of the first movement, the figure stepped into the light. It was Josephine, Bailey, director of the Westfield Symphony. "Magnificent," she said, applauding as Elena finished playing. Elena started, turning on the bench. "Don't stop on my account," Josephine said, walking toward the stage. "I came by to check on preparations for next week's concert and heard someone playing. I should have known it was you." Elena smiled shyly. "I'm still working out some rough spots." That's why I'm here, actually, Josephine said. I wanted to ask if you'd consider a change to the program. Elena felt a flutter of anxiety. What kind of change? Instead of playing a solo piece, how would you feel about performing the Rachmaninoff concerto with the full orchestra? Elena's eyes widened. The entire concerto? With the orchestra? Josephine nodded. Based on what I just heard, you're more than ready. And it would be a much more dramatic return to the stage. Elena looked at Pavel, who was beaming. I don't know, she said hesitantly. That's a lot more pressure. It's also a lot more support, Josephine pointed out. You won't be alone on that stage. You'll have 60 musicians backing you. Elena bit her lip, considering. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating. Can I think about it? She asked. Of course, Josephine replied, but not too long. The orchestra would need time to prepare. After Josephine left, Elena turned to Pavel. What do you think? Am I ready for that? Pavel studied her face. The question isn't whether you're ready technically, it's whether you're ready emotionally. To truly step back into the spotlight, not as a novelty, the cleaning lady who surprised everyone, but as Elena Petrova, concert pianist. Elena played a few soft chords, thinking. For so long I tried to forget that part of myself. I thought it was gone forever. Yet here you are, Pavel said gently. Elena nodded. Then, with sudden determination, she pulled out her phone and called Josephine. I'll do it, she said when the director answered. The full concerto. Pavel smiled proudly as she hung up. Now, he said, we practice. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind. Elena rehearsed daily with the orchestra, growing more confident with each session. Victor's management team arranged for a new dress, publicity photos, interviews with select media outlets. They created social media accounts for her that quickly gained hundreds of thousands of followers. The night before the big performance, Elena couldn't sleep. She paced her small apartment, playing sections of the concerto in her head, worrying about difficult passages. Around midnight, her phone rang. It was Victor. Just checking in, he said. Figured you might be awake. I'm terrified, Elena admitted. Victor chuckled. Good. That means you care. What if I mess up? What if I can't remember the notes? What if you're brilliant? Victor interrupted. What if this is the beginning of the career you were always meant to have? What if tomorrow night changes everything? Elena took a deep breath. I never thought I'd get a second chance. Most people don't, Victor said softly. That's what makes your story so powerful, Elena. You're giving hope to anyone who ever had to give up on a dream. After they hung up, Elena went to the window and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, people were buying tickets to hear her play. People were talking about her, wondering about her. For the first time in decades, Elena allowed herself to feel something she had long ago buried beneath layers of practicality and resignation. Hope. The day of the concert arrived with a clear blue sky and a crispness in the air that felt like a good omen. Elena woke early after finally falling asleep just before dawn. She made herself a cup of tea and sat at the piano, not to practice. Her fingers needed rest before tonight, but simply to feel its presence, like a friend offering silent encouragement. A knock at the door startled her. It was Rose holding a small bouquet of daisies. Thought you might need some moral support, Rose said, handing Elena the flowers. Elena's eyes filled with tears. You have no idea how much. Rose came in, looking around the apartment with interest. Nice piano, she remarked. Seems like you've moved up in the world, Elena smiled. It's just on loan, but yes, things have changed. The cleaning crew misses you, Rose said. Nobody polishes the brass railings quite like you do. They both laughed, and Elena felt some of her nervousness ease. Are you coming tonight? She asked. Rose nodded. Wouldn't miss it, Mr. Crawford. Gave us all tickets. Front row seats if you can believe it. Elena's eyebrows shot up. The cleaning staff? In the front row? Apparently we're part of your story now, Rose said with a wink. the people who knew you when. After Rose left, Elena tried to eat something, knowing she'd need her strength, but her stomach was tied in knots. Instead, she showered and dressed in comfortable clothes, then carefully packed the gown she would wear for the performance, a deep blue silk that shimmered like water when she moved. Her phone buzzed with messages throughout the day. Victor checking in. Pavel sending encouragement. Even Thomas, her ex-husband, had heard the news and wished her luck. At 4 o'clock, a car arrived to take her to the concert hall for final preparations. The venue was different from Westfield, larger, more prestigious. The Lincoln Center, with its soaring architecture and rich history, was a place Elena had only dreamed of entering as a performer. Backstage was a flurry of activity. Orchestra members warmed up, producing a cacophony of sound that was somehow both chaotic and beautiful. Stage managers rushed about with clipboards. Lighting technicians made final adjustments. Elena was led to a private dressing room with her name on the door. Inside, someone had placed a vase of roses with a card that simply read, "Welcome back, PD." Pavel Dmitriev's small gesture of kindness brought fresh tears to her eyes. A gentle knock announced the arrival of a makeup artist and hairstylist. Elena had never had such treatment before, and felt awkward as they worked on her, transforming the ordinary cleaning lady into someone who belonged on a concert stage. When they finished, Elena barely recognized her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked elegant, confident, every inch the concert pianist. But inside she still felt like Elena the cleaner, afraid of being discovered as an imposter. Josephine stopped by to check on her. 30 minutes to curtain, she said. How are you feeling? Like I might throw up, Elena admitted. Josephine laughed. That's normal. Even after 30 years of performing, I still get butterflies. She sat down beside Elena. I wanted to tell you something before you go out there. Elena looked at her, expectantly. When I was a young conductor, I had a professor who said something I never forgot. He said, "Music already exists in its perfect form. Our job is not to create it, but to release it, to let it flow through us as purely as possible." Josephine squeezed Elena's hand. Don't think about the audience. Don't think about the notes. Just be the vessel for the music that's already there waiting. Elena nodded, finding comfort in those words. As Josephine left, Victor appeared in the doorway. Ready for your big comeback? Elena stood smoothing her gown nervously. Not remotely. Victor grinned. Perfect. Remember when I called you up on stage as a joke? His face grew serious. I need to apologize for that again. Don't, Elena interrupted. If you hadn't done that, I wouldn't be here now. She managed a small smile. Sometimes humiliation is the beginning of something wonderful. A stagehand appeared. 5 minutes, Miss Petrova. Elena took a deep breath. This was it. After 23 years of silence, after giving up on her dreams, after building a completely different life, she was about to step back onto a concert stage, not as an unknown child prodigy, but as a woman who had lived, suffered, endured, and somehow found her way back to music. Victor gave her arm a gentle squeeze. Break a leg out there. The walk to the stage seemed both endless and too short. Elena could hear the orchestra already seated, the low hum of the audience, the rustle of programs. She waited in the wings as Josephine took the conductor's podium, and the concert began with a short piece by Mozart. Then it was time. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer's voice filled the hall. Please welcome, performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor, Elena Petrova. A burst of applause greeted her as she walked onto the stage. The lights were bright, making it hard to see the audience, but Elena could make out the front row where the cleaning staff sat, Rose among them, clapping wildly. Elena bowed, then took her seat at the magnificent grand piano. She adjusted the bench slightly, placed her hands in her lap, and waited for Josephine's cue. The concerto began with solo piano, those same dark, powerful chords she had practiced in the empty concert. Elena's fingers pressed into the keys, drawing out sounds that resonated through her entire body. Then the orchestra joined, surrounding her with a wave of music that lifted and carried her. There was a moment, about 4 minutes into the first movement, when Elena hit a passage that had troubled her during practice. For a split second, panic threatened to overwhelm her. But she remembered Josephine's words about being a vessel for the music, and somehow her fingers found their way. From that point on, Elena stopped thinking. She stopped worrying about making mistakes or what the critics might say or whether she deserved this second chance. She simply played, letting the music flow through her, having a conversation with Rachmaninoff across the decades. The second movement was like telling a story, her story, of loss and longing and quiet determination. The melody sang with a bittersweet quality that brought tears to many eyes in the audience, and the third movement, with its triumphant theme and thundering octaves, felt like resurrection, like coming back to life after a long hibernation. When Elena played the final chords and lifted her hands from the keyboard, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the audience erupted. They rose to their feet as one, applauding, shouting, "Bravo!" Some were crying openly. Rose and the cleaning crew were jumping up and down, cheering for their friend who had hidden her light for so long. Elena stood, her legs shaky, and bowed. The applause grew even louder. Josephine came to the piano and shook her hand, beaming, with pride. The concertmaster stood, leading the orchestra in their own applause for the soloist. Flowers were brought onto the stage, more than Elena could hold in her arms. She bowed again and again as the ovation continued, showing no signs of stopping. Finally, Elena returned to the piano and raised her hands for silence. The audience quieted immediately, anticipating an encore. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. 23 years ago, I stopped believing in myself. I stopped believing that music could be part of my life. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. I was wrong. She settled back onto the bench and began to play one last piece. Not a virtuosic showstopper, but a simple, heartfelt rendition of Debussy's Clair de Lune. It was the first piece her father had ever taught her, back when her fingers could barely span an octave. As the gentle notes filled the hall, Elena felt her father's presence. She felt the path of her life, the triumphs and tragedies, the long detour through grief and survival, and now this unexpected return. Backstage after the concert, well-wishers crowded around. Critics raved. Recording executives pressed business cards into her hands. But the moment that mattered most to Elena came when Rose and the cleaning crew pushed their way through the crowd to hug her. "We always knew you were special," Rose said, wiping away tears. "We just didn't know how special." Later that night, after the celebrations and interviews, Elena returned to her small apartment. The piano waited for her in the cramped living room, a reminder that this new chapter was real. Her phone was filled with messages, offers for concerts in Paris, London, Tokyo, requests for interviews, a book deal. It was overwhelming. But for now, Elena simply sat at the piano in her beautiful gown, playing softly for herself in the quiet of night. Tomorrow would bring decisions and changes. Tomorrow would begin the next phase of her improbable journey. Tonight, though, was for savoring the simple miracle. The cleaning lady had found her way home.